Hello, Africa and the world. Thank you for trusting your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. Ladies and gentlemen, this day we shall be focusing in West Africa, precisely in Mali, where after France 24 and Radio France International, acronymed RFI, the Malian government has suspended for a duration of 2 months French broadcast channel LCI. The announcement on Saturday is attributed to justifying terrorism on the national territory. The broadcast channel was also accused of inciting the destabilization of the internal crisis, according to local media reports. These latest developments comes after the Superior Council for Communications of Burkina Faso, a neighboring country and equally part of the AES Confederation, but the LCI for airing in the country for 3 months for false or spreading false information about the situation with violence in the country in June 2023. Let's recall that late last month, the chief of the Malian Air Forces, Aliou Bouadara, had accused certain countries of attempting to infringe on the country's sovereignty and meddle in the internal affairs of the West African nation. Amidst all these new latest developments taking part in the West African country and of course the West African sub-region, we shall be analyzing these this day with our guests in the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for trusting your Pan-African channel. Stay with us. Hello, Africa and the world. Thank you for joining us this day over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa, where we focus on Mali with the suspension of a French broadcast channel LCI. And of course, this comes after several French broadcast news channels have been suspended, not just in the West African nation of Mali, but equally in neighboring countries, all within the AES Confederation. And of course, we shall be evoking these topic of discussion this day with Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who is a Pan-Africanist, joining us all the way from the U.S. Thank you, immensely, sir, for honoring our invitation.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and thank you for always inviting me, and I hope today we have a very fruitful conversation.
Absolutely, we look forward to fruitful conversations, given there is a wind of change that is blowing across the West African sub-region. Subsequently, we shall be joined by SHITTU FOWORA, a digital news editor. We shall be joining us equally from the West African sub-region. Now to dive right into these questions, but before that, we should reiterate to our televiewers and listeners that you are watching us on For You Television, listening to us on For You Radio FM 96.3, For You Radio Africa, and of course we are streaming on our social media platforms, Facebook and YouTube. So now to dig into discussions this day, Dr. FONGOD, you follow these latest developments. Now, what's your take on this recent decision by the Malian authorities to suspend another French broadcast news channel?
Well, I think that we are in a very fluid situation. We are dealing with, we are here in uncharted territories, especially when it comes to our evolving state in the Sahel region, as these three nations has come together, and we are trying to go to find new ways in which we can be able to control the narrative so far as information is concerned. What that means is this, that we have to understand that it's not just, we cannot just look at this from what is it that the Malian government decided to do. I'm also trying to go to make sure that whatever it is that is being done, it is, you know, it should be able to be in a way in which the sovereignty of the nations involved are, you know, basically protected. And on the other hand, I also want to make sure that we understand that advocacy journalism has no place. I think that one of the worst possible things that can actually happen to a journalist is when we have lost our tenets of faith, whatever it is, when we have basically decided that we will become more advocates for whatever political persuasion we believe in, or whatever political persuasion that our organizations we work for believe in, which is basically one of the major problems that people have trusting, news media this day. The reason for that is because every single time you turn around Some journalists is giving their opinion. Some journalists is telling us exactly how they feel. Some journalists is telling us exactly what they think. We don't care about what you think. We don't care about how you feel. We don't care what your emotional state is. What we care about is you reporting the news as it is. Your opinion on the news is absolutely irrelevant, and so this is why most people no longer trust the news, and this happens in the West. If you watch something like CNN, you will realize that a channel like CNN is absolutely pro-liberal. Anything that is liberal goes on that channel. Anything that is conservative, you will not find it on that channel. Likewise, if you watch something like Fox News in the US, it's actually pro-conservative. Anything that is liberal does not fly on that channel. Everything that's on the channel is consecutive. So we have come into a stage in time where journalism has become pure advocacy, and that in itself is absolutely wrong. We need to be able to dial things back and get to a place where journalists used to absolutely just report the news, say exactly what's happening, but the best information that you have, be absolutely factual. Don't interject. Don't become an activist for somebody's, political persuasions or some political group or some agenda. Just report the news. And unfortunately, I don't think that we have that today. And so if Mali is taking the stance he has taken, against these media outlets by basically shutting them down, is because obviously you have to be able to protect the narrative. You need to be able to state what the narrative is. If you're a nation, you have to protect your people. You need to be able to make sure that your people are getting the most accurate information that they can. And so if there's a news outlet out there which is basically trying to be able to sabotage that process because that brings instability, then you have every right to be able to say no. And on the other hand also, we have to be careful where we do not allow these nations to be able to start doing things, that becomes so authoritative and authoritarian, where, journalism and the freedom of press is absolutely, missing. So there has to be that counterbalance between free speech and what is absolutely, just pure propaganda.
And of course, there is this journalism statement or quotes that says, facts are sacred, but opinions are free. Now, staying with you, Dr. Fongod, now this is not the first time we're seeing French media being suspended in one of the West African nations, but yet, could we say that this suspension comes because they were advocating, just in line with what you said, advocating for probably an agenda that is not in line with the core values of the institutions of the country like Mali?
Absolutely. And first of all, the reality is this, that if you look at France, France has done a lot of things on the African continent that is absolutely distasteful. And it's France, strongman, policy on the African continent is quite shameful. And so France has literally moved from the colonial era. They have gone past that, and now we are entering into the fifth generation warfare, which America is absolutely a master in it. And that fifth generational warfare is the control of the narrative, is the control of the mirror of the media. And so what France is doing right now is, we might not absolutely need to shoot a gun. We might not put foot soldiers in Mali. We might not have foot soldiers in Burkina Faso. There might not be foot soldiers in Niger. But we can absolutely create tremendous chaos by just reporting false information, misinformation, all right, to the public, and then get people all worked up, and then suddenly we start having revolutions and counter-revolutions. The Arab Spring was the first time we actually saw the fifth generational warfare system, in operation on the African continent. And so that's just to state that it absolutely worked. And so if, for national sovereignty's sake, we need to be able to make sure that things like this do not happen. I'm in support of everything, that, Mali basically did. I'm also in support of the fact that those boys in the Sahel will not take this hook, line, and sinker. I'm also trying to be able to make sure we understand that media has tremendous influence, and if we do not control, if we do not control. When I say control, I'm not saying control in relationship to basically shutting anybody down with free speech. No, I'm saying that we need to be able to identify when a fifth generational warfare system is in progress and do whatever it takes to be able to put an end to it. If not, we lose our sovereignty. If not, we throw a whole entire nation into chaos because some knucklehead with an iPhone, or an Android phone will basically start creating, tremendous problems on social media, and then suddenly you see things happening. If you look at a country like Kenya, the issues of Kenya was not just because some boys in Kenya decided to do whatever they was trying to do. No, the issues of Kenya had everything to do with the fact that when the government decided to start doing other things, there are people on the sideline waiting for the least opportunity to create the fifth generational warfare system so that they can actually destabilize a country. And I think that it actually worked in the case of Kenya. The people of Kenya, the young men in Kenya, thought in their minds that they were trying to be able to go against, the finance bill, but what they did not know that the finance bill was an ends to a means for a bigger agenda outside of Kenya. So we have to be able to make sure that we fully understand this so that we put everybody in check.
Absolutely. It's all about censorship, of course. Now, highlighting this different issue, now, media in every nation is regarded as the fourth A state because, of course, there are certain ethics that are being, that guide, of course, this celestial profession. But then, why do we, or what accounts for this persistence and continuous suspension of French media channels in the West African sub-region, to be precise, mostly those that have undergone military transitions and, of course, are headed towards different leadership? Why is it, say, particularly in that particular region? What accounts for this change which we are seeing in recent times?
Well, if you look at France and if you look at her interest on the African continent, that interest it's there, and that interest is being threatened by the fact that most Francophone countries are literally waking up from the oppression and the stalemate that they have been in as a result of France. Now people are becoming conscious, and as a result of that, France does not like that. Secondly, I think that France has a systemic racism that has been enshrined in her fiber, in her being. I have watched French journalists interviewed Africans, and with such disdain, with such horror. And they say this, and it's to them is quite normal. It's quite normal for them to be that racist. And obviously, when they're reporting on the African continent, they think they're reporting about some plantation. Obviously, they have used Africa as a plantation. They think they're reporting about some, some third world worker, in some refugee camp somewhere. That has been the ideas. And so, unfortunately for us, we are living in an environment where you have these people who say whatever they want to say, and they say it because they are doing the beating, for France. Almost every French media is owned and controlled in some part by the French, by the French government, even in the areas of telecommunication. For example, you're dealing with a company like Orange in Cameroon. That too is owned in part by the government of France. And so you have to understand the full control that whatever these media outlets are trying to be able to push, they are trying to be able to push what it is that is in the interest of France. And so they will control the narrative, how be it to them that's not journalism, but they will control the narrative to be able to make France looks good. But then that will also make the African, that will make those boys in the Sahel looks absolutely bad, in the public eye, so far as the people are concerned. So you're dealing with journalists who are working for corporations, and those corporations are under intense pressure from the powers that be to set the narratives that they want. And that's the problem we are facing.
So And this, we should reiterate, it comes amidst the tensions we have been seeing between France, that was a former colonial power in the West African sub-region, to most of these countries, and of course tensions because we've seen in recent times French troops being sent out of these three countries. But all the same, you said that. So what you're actually highlighting is the media, or say this French media, actually some sort of a weapon of propaganda as far as telling the narrative or setting the agenda for telling the African story is concerned.
Absolutely. And so you really need to understand, it's not even just so much about the African story, it's that we are fast moving in a world where a lot of things are happening at the same time. There's a war taking place between Russia and Ukraine. Unfortunately, a couple of days ago, we heard within the Sahel region, a couple of Wagner's fighters being killed. That was basically the genesis for most of these, outage of these French channels. But then to absolutely tell you exactly where France stands, just a few days ago, a Russian, the head of and the creator of an app called Telegram, was arrested in France for disinformations and propaganda and trafficking. I mean, the list goes on. So we're talking about a country like France that is actively involved, in a lot, in a lot of fronts. Number one, on the African continent, and also out there in the, having issues with Russia as we speak because of the things that is happening in Ukraine. So Africa is nothing else but basically a stage for most of the proxy war that we see happening right now. So obviously, French channels will report whatever is favorable to the French government, and they will say whatever they have to say, just so that, those on the African continent and whoever their counterparts will be, especially in this case, Russia, looks extremely, look extremely bad. So that's not journalism, that's activism, and that's, that's advocacy, which has no place, in reporting the news. We just need to report the news the way it is, and there's no reason, for us to become a propaganda, either for the government or against the government. We are quite neutral. I think that's what journalism is all about.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Just got indications that SHITTU FOWORA, digital news editor journalist all the way from Lagos, Nigeria, has just joined us. Good day to you, sir. So I was discussing with your co-panelists regarding these latest developments which we have seen in the West African nation of Mali. Now, given you're part of the media, and of course, I was telling your co-panelists that the media is regarded as the fourth estate of every nation. Now, in that regard, how did you welcome this decision by the Malian authorities to suspend yet another media house? And of course, how does this turn in the bid to continue to strain the relations that do exist between these West African nations and the former colonial master?
Thank you for having me. Basically, what we have, or what we are seeing continually, is Mali and French-speaking part of West Africa asserting its sovereignty. Essentially, one, does not want unfavorable reportage. Two, it does not believe that misreporting activities happening on ground would be the fairest thing to do. So some of the suspensions that you are seeing is in reaction to international politics, the manner of reportage of events across the world. And so Mali is clearly saying that this is the path to stand by, and this is the path that everybody must toe if you have to report from the Malian territory. So I totally understand. I wouldn't blame the junta. But what is clear is that the junta is continually setting the stage, for those who it wants to interact with. We all know that it has moved from its pro-France stance to pro-Kremlin stance. So because it's continually having more engagement with Russia, there's a chance that it will not take lightly any reportage that sounds critical of Russia. Yeah.
Now, your co-panelists and yourself, people have cited a point. Now, yes, these tensions are ongoing between France and Russia, but then amidst the ideological warfare which we've seen in recent times, now, could you say, because the French channel LCI was accused of undermining the nation's security. We know that Mali is one of those countries that happen to be in the Sahelian region and of course has been facing its own challenges as far as security is concerned. But then it's equally been accused of justifying terrorism. And now, as a media expert, with the reaction we have gotten so far from the Malian authorities, what's your take as far as, could you say that this media is actually involving itself in this ideological warfare? Because we saw a couple of days where Mali was actually cautioning Ukraine as far as an attack that led to the death of many was concerned.
Well, once it is, you have scenarios like this, it is clear that every country wants to assert its sovereignty. But what I can basically point out are three issues. One is on the political tension between Russia and Ukraine, or basically in extension between Kremlin and the West. Two, you have media influence. France understands that it has certain control and penetration of the of parts of Africa, especially the Francophone speaking nations. So it is trying to battle between the influence it has always enjoyed before now, and what it now has at the moment. So there is that struggle to maintain relevance and influence in spite of not being in the same political trajectory with Mali and other Francophone countries. And thirdly, you have issue of sovereignty. Each country will want to assert, its sovereignty and reduce unnecessary foreign interference, in its polity. So it is seeing, it is looking at, French stations, or pro-French stations as stations that are trying to shape the narrative. Just like you said, yes, the media is the fourth estate of the realm, but sometimes the media is misused or misapplied, because of other agenda, that people are pursuing. So going forward, there has to be ways in which, to fill in the information void. If you do not want French-speaking, stations to misreport what you have on ground or what you have abroad, then you must give inroad for non-French speaking, stations or stations that are not aligned to France. So you have issues around diplomatic, strain. You have issues around freedom of press because, again, not everybody working for these stations are biased, for example. So you cannot punish the entire station. So I understand that the suspension is for 2 months. People will be out of work for some time, and some of these people will be Malians in any case. So these issues should be, should be on the front burner. The diplomacy that exists between Mali and the foreign countries that are being involved in this war, because again, Mali or any other African country should not be the battleground for unnecessary altercations and unnecessary war. The war is happening elsewhere, but because of our relationship or alignment with certain countries of the world, we may be seen as either pro-Russia or anti-Russia. Again, there are countries in Africa that want to remain neutral. War is an unfortunate scenario. When it happens, we're looking out to see how things can be ironed out, as against, we're supporting X against Y.
Absolutely, Shittu. Now, to proceed back with you, Dr. Fongod, do you share the same opinion as your co-panelist?
Absolutely. I think that there is a place, where we really need to step back and understand that there has to be that balance between what freedom of press is and when advocacy, it's what is of the order of the day. The reason for that also is just like my co-panelist said, when you suspend a media channel that the What you've also done in essence is that you've also taken a couple of people out of work. And then, that does not, help in the long run. So it's a matter of being able to be firm as to what the policy is, what can be reported, what cannot be reported, and the manner in which this reporting will take place. It has to be fair, and it has to be balanced. And I think that is what is needed. If that's not the case, we cannot just suspend, channels and see you can report. That will be creating an authoritarian, regime in Mali or in the Sahel that is absolutely not acceptable. We cannot also become, totally intolerant, so far as criticisms are concerned. And that basically means that once the public opinion is no longer, needed, then we have basically fallen into anarchy. There has to be freedom of press, freedom of speech. And I think that the beauty about freedom of press and freedom of speech is the fact that it brings about public discourse. We need to be in an environment where we can absolutely have diverse opinions that, so that we can be able to understand exactly what is it that we are trying to do. There is something to be said about a university. Which is basically a university is unity in diversity. So a university, it's unity in diversity. It's an environment where we come with counter perspective, different ideas, where we can be able to find out which one is the most dominant idea, which one basically makes sense, which one jive rather, well, what is it that we are trying to do? But if those ideas are not there, if you are in an environment where you're told what to think and you're told what to say, and you do not have the capacity to think things for yourself, then that throws each and every one of us into a country which is absolutely, not important, neither would it help us in the long run so far as, building a nation is concerned. So I think that those are the things that we need to look into, and as my co-panelist said, I'm absolutely in support of what he said, and we have to be able to include the fact that there has to be freedom of press, irrespective of what is going on, and then allow the local people on the ground to fully be able to be integrated so that they can, too, know exactly what's going on and have their voices being heard, and so that the voices of the nation should not be in the hands of a select few. The voices of the nation should be in the hands of the collective. That's democracy.
Democracy, indeed. I will coming back to you regarding that point, Dr. Fongod, but then let me take you, Shittu. You listen to your co-panelists, but then we have this issue and this need where experts on Pan-Africanism on the continent have urged or called for this need for Africans to tell the African story from an Afrocentric perspective. Now, being a media expert or media personnel, what's your take on this aspect? How can Africa go about this? Because we'll always have, say, people will look at the African continent from a different perspective and definitely tell a story that is not a true reflection of what's on ground. So how can Africans go about this move of telling the true and authentic story from a true and authentic, or say, Afrocentric perspective?
One of the issues that the continent is facing is the issue of infrastructure. If you have the wherewithal to communicate with the local populace with the right infrastructure, why would the average Somalian or say Ivorian switch to foreign media, for example? If there is no unnecessary interference with local media, there's a chance that nobody will be bothered about the foreign media. So what we should be doing is to promote local media, invest in infrastructural development for better broadcasting and coverage of our content. Two, we should have regional corporations, because again, reportage is better from the perspective of those who are on ground. So when we have collaborations between African states, it is very likely that we'll have better reportage, and it will help further, the image, and the story of Africa. Another thing is that in terms of our international relationship, we should be balanced, because while two countries may be at war at the moment, or maybe at loggerheads at the moment, you don't want to be caught in between here and there, because there are international agreements, there are contracts that you have signed, which may suffer because you're having unnecessary altercations. Russia's investments in Africa, or France's investment in Africa, has suffered a lot of setback because, of the realignment of the political forces in each of these countries.
Shittu, are you with us? Hopefully, you'll be connecting back with us. Unfortunately, we got interrupted due to some technical disruptions, but all the same, we're hoping that you get back to us. So we proceed this interesting conversation around the recent suspension of a French broadcast channel, LCI, in Mali. And now I'll champion that question now to you, Dr. FONGOD. You listened to what your co-panelist was saying as far as Africans telling a true and authentic story from an Afrocentric perspective. What do you have to say about that? Oh, unfortunately, we just got, fortunately for us, we got Shittu back with us. Please kindly proceed.
Okay, so basically, I was saying that we must improve our dialogue and diplomacy on the continent. We must improve media literacy on the continent. We must also improve on infrastructure, on the continent to help us, get to the right audience. We must also ensure that we have regional collaborations and cooperation, such that our reportage can be corroborated by other African states. Again, it is when there is an information gap, it is when you have a news gap, that other international agents begin to fill it up for us. We cannot dictate to them how they report, what they see. However, but we can insist that this is how we want to be heard and this is how we want to be seen. So all of this, can help us move forward, to promote media literacy, improve infrastructure, media infrastructure on the continent, improve our diplomacy, and the rule of engagement with some of our international partners, so that our contracts, our foreign relationship will not suffer because of our alignment, with certain political forces.
Thank you so much, Shittu. Back to you, Dr. FONGOD. Now, I was asking you earlier on, what do you have to say? You listen to your co-panel as far as Africans telling the African story from an African perspective. I think you've been championing for such an ideology for the longest of times in recent years. So what do you have to say about that?
I think it's very important for us to understand that no one can tell our story better than us. We are Africans, and so we need Africans to tell the story of the African. For so many years, the African has been thrown under this boundary where we have been given everything else, except what is African. The Europeans have been the one telling our stories. They have written our stories. We have read books that have been written on Africa by Europeans from a Eurocentric perspective, not from an Afrocentric perspective. So we need Africans with an Afrocentric perspective, Africans who are like us to tell our stories from an Afrocentric perspective, from the vantage point of being black. I don't know exactly what some Caucasian has to say when it comes to writing the history of somebody in a place like Ghana, in a place like Kumasi. I don't know what a European have to say when it comes to writing the story of somebody from a place like Bali. All right, so you need to be able to have someone who is an African to tell our own stories. And I think that this is very important. I'm basically going to be with Mr. Shittu on this one, that we have to be able to make sure that we raise a generation of young people from the African continent who are passionate about talking about our stories, who are passionate about reporting as to what is happening on the continent of Africa. There's something to be said about when a journalist basically reports from their area, not just because that's their area of study, but because that is the area of birth. There are ways in which they know the story. There are ways in which they understand what is happening, in ways that when they report about it, it is not basically going to be from a third or a fourth person perspective. It's actually from a first-person perspective because they are part of the story. They are talking about themselves. So I think that we have to be able to build up, our local infrastructure to be able to, to do that. And I am in support 100% that we have to stop, we have to curb, we have to suspend. Whatever we have to do, we basically have to filter out all of this foreign media presence on the continent of Africa. These are nothing else but just channels for propaganda. These are channels, to throw in Western ideologies and mindsets and, throw in fake generational warfare structures and strategies. Let us be able to firmly build and consume that which is African. I think the African deserves that.
Indeed, the African deserves that. Now, Shittu, in a bit to look at another angle of this telling of an African story from an African perspective. We're talking about Africans being trained while they're growing up to be able to love the African continent, champion for the interests of the African continent. Now, in your perspective, what role can culture, how can culture come in as far as championing for this Africa which we want is concerned?
Well, culture is a veritable vehicle to drive, the true color, the true concept, the true ideas, and the true philosophy of the African people. And to promote culture, you have to be true to your actions. You have to ensure that in all that you do, it reflects the African culture. Now, that is what stands us out as a people. Like I did say, there's a particular culture that Africans have continued to rely on for a very long time, which is very, very untoward. The idea of going to seek from the West or from the East, as the case may be. I mean, he who goes a-borrowing goes a-sorrowing. That is what the wise words say. But the question is, we must be the ones telling our own story. We must take, the front line and tell our stories in such ways that others can only leverage on what we have said, as against telling us what to say or what to do. Again, nobody can blow your trumpet better than you who is handling the trumpet. So we must inculcate the mindset, discipline, the understanding that our solutions can be homegrown. We see that in the ways that our presidents, our leaders relate to the leaders of the West and the East. We see that in the ways that a lot of Africans are seeking, education outside the shores of the continent. We see that even in the way that we export our minerals without processing them, So again, we must grow to the point where we say that enough of exporting, of going external for everything we need, which are, local solutions, to our local problems. So again, it is totally up to us. We cannot resolve issues by merely hoping that others from outside will resolve it by solving it for us. We who face these problems will have a better perspective on how to solve it, and we should have homegrown solutions. That is why the Chinese tigers are making headway. They always look for homegrown solutions to their problems. They could go any part of the world to seek for these solutions, but they will domesticate it. So we must be seen to be doing that. We shouldn't allow, international voices to speak for us.
Absolutely, Shittu. Now coming back to you, Dr. Fongod. You listened to your co-panelists, and of course, just in line with what you said earlier, we've seen the suspension, and if it actually came up was because there was some sort of conflict of interest between Franks of the media house and of course the Malian authorities. But all the same, now from the perspective of a Pan-Africanist, of an expert, we have this question of Africans actually redefining the kind of partnerships they welcome on the African continent, so it gets to benefit not just the African people, but leads to the development and of course prosperity of Africa. Now, In that regard, what would you say Africa needs to do for it to be able to redefine some of the partnerships it does have, the relations it has with the external world, so it gets to benefit, and not just in the sector of development, but in the sector of Africa's own growth and prosperity?
There are two things that I think that Africa should really focus on. The first is that Africa needs to invest heavily on the media sector. It needs to invest heavily in education. It has to invest heavily in infrastructural development, especially when it comes to internet connectivity, the telecommunications sector. Those three areas are so vital for everything, especially when it comes to us pushing the narrative and being able to get every African on board. If we are able to build and get a robust system where on the African continent, young men get to the place where they are able to tell their story, they are able to report what's happening on the African continent and push that, whether it be in the forms of entertainment or just being in the form of news, just news reporting, or even having an opinion so far as news is concerned, or maybe being a talk show host on anything, let it be from an Afrocentric perspective. If we're able to push that, what that will do is we basically start changing the narrative and the culture of the people to align with the Pan-African agenda, because without the Pan-African agenda, there is no Africa. Period. There will be no Africa. Secondly, we need to invest heavily in education, and the reason for that is because we have to be able to get people who are knowledgeable within the Pan-African space, number one, who are knowledgeable in engineering, who are knowledgeable, in the fifth industrial revolution technologies, so that we can be able to prepare the young people for the job market. And in the world in which we live in today, Africa is no longer contained within the continent. Africa is open to the entire world. So is every other continent. So is every nation around the world. And the reason is because we are interconnected with these, fiber links and satellite systems that have basically created, this merge, this network, of internet connectivity, where we've become one big global village. If that was going to be true, work on the African continent should not be contained within the continent. People can be on the African continent and work somewhere else, but we need to be able to prepare the African for that job market. We need to prepare the African, to have the skill sets that it takes so that they can be able, to be on the continent of Africa and work anywhere else in the world, which will be advantageous to the African if the African just stayed home, because that means, we are developing the nations with the remittance that we get from, the jobs we do and the remittance that comes in from those who are outside in the diaspora, bringing in money into the continent. Number three, we have to be able to make sure, no matter what happens, that the infrastructures are there. The infrastructures are there to be able to support, all of these technologies. There are people in the inner cities. There are people, in the rural areas, folks who are, all over the landscape that are far away from, our urban areas that still need to be able to have access to internet connectivity. And with that internet connectivity, for those who basically have difficulties basically in areas of education, we can be able to set up platforms for them to be able to have some kind of studies, right, on platforms that will basically e-learning platforms. We need to be able to set this up. Without us doing these three things, it will be extremely difficult for us to move from where we are to where we have to be. And then we absolutely must be able to understand that if we are going to bring people to power, this will be people who have one thing in mind. They must have the visions of people like Kwame Nkrumah. They must have the visions of people like Patrice Lumumba. These are people who understand that Africa is going to literally succeed if Africa has leaders who are Afrocentric, who thinks about Africa from the perspective that Africa is not just, this continent. Africa needs to rise and take her place in the world. We are home to almost, all the minerals that the world needs. We are home to almost everything that the world is looking for, literally, just this continent alone, all right? And we have 60% of the world arable land that is good for agriculture. It's right here on the continent of Africa. And I think it's going to be a great shame and a disservice to humanity and a disservice to Africans, a disservice to our ancestors if we do not fight to make sure that we push the continent to a place where we set the narratives to the wall and we are no longer considered as a byproduct to human civilization. We are the originators and forerunners of human civilization. I think that's what we need to do. Take care of, you know, the media platform so that those who are reporting report from an Afrocentric perspective so that we can get young people, you know, basically in a place where they're excited about the continent. Take care of our educational system so that we can train people and bring them to a place where they can become ready for the job market, especially in the fifth industrial revolution technologies, and then make sure that infrastructure is there to support all of this, which is be internet connectivity, you know, good road systems, so that communications of goods and services can be seamless, you know, across the so-called borders we have on the continent.
Thank you. Adding to what you said, Dr. FONGOD, SHITTU, do you believe that this recent media gag we've seen across the West African sub-region is showing that the region is headed towards liberation or positive independence?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is the situation. One of the things that technology has done lately for us is that it is helping us to see things in real time. Journalists across the continent are able to find information quickly and are able to, you know, contest against the position of government. They are able to debunk lies. They are able to fact check whatever government is saying.
That is true.
So increasingly, government has to do the right thing in order to ensure that the media also does its own part. However, the continuous gag of even journalists who are being repressed is a problem. And so for us to grow as a continent, we must practice ethical journalism. The government must ensure that there is press freedom, and it should also ensure that people can practice without fear that they will be intimidated or fear that they will be compromised.
So now, staying with you, SHITTU, now you said that there should be several measures put in place or regulations as far as the practice of the profession is concerned. But all the same, amidst this, do you advocate for censorship when we see different, or say, foreign media bridging some of the gaps which they are not supposed to, or say breaking some of the rules and regulations which initially were not supposed to be broken?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it is not even an argument, because when foreign media violates the extant rules, you know, of engagement, there should be penalties. Because again, the reason why some of us are not saying that this is being done to Africans is that we probably can't find a lot of African, you know, reporters, or sorry, African broadcasting stations stationed in foreign land reporting from those ends. Because if that is the case, then there's a chance that when they breach certain protocols, then there will be sanctions and penalties. Even local stations are being sanctioned for false, you know, reportage or misreportage, as the case may be. Where I have an issue with is when there is censorship, undue censorship or repression of the media, just like we have seen, you know, in Nigeria lately and some other parts of the continent, where journalists or whistleblowers are being taken randomly on the, you know, are being arrested or you know, taken by the secret police, hidden for a long time without any official statement to the public. It is totally uncalled for, and it continues to put fear in the minds of a lot of journalists who ordinarily are working on cases that can save the nation. So when there is that atmosphere created, that journalists understand that they can work without any repression, without any oppression, without being gagged, without being, you know, detained unnecessarily, for example, then there will be, you know, information flow will flourish. But when you have an atmosphere where people are being gagged and disallowed from, you know, from airing their opinions or from reporting the facts that they can find on ground, then it becomes a lot problematic.
Thank you, Shittu, for joining us all the way from Nigeria. Now, to proceed with you, Dr. FONGOD, you listen to your co-panelists, and just in that regard, we are living now in a neo-colonial era, but away from that perspective, of course, what would it take for Africa, not just the media sector, to become independent? Because this is a question we've asked numerous times in the course of this program, but then we're looking at these from the perspective of, say, different people setting the agenda for the African continent, telling or shaping the narrative. Now, in that light, how can Africa actually shape a trajectory or actually pave the way towards its own independence?
I think it has everything to do with money. As long as we keep borrowing, all right, we keep borrowing from the West, we borrow from the East, we borrow from everybody else, we've become a pawn in the hands of the World Bank, in the hands of, God knows, the United Nations, because we have to go and beg and cry and says, please help us, we can't pay our loans, you know, I mean, we're going to default, we don't know what to do. And then those, you know, groups have to sit and look at Africa as one gigantic orphanage where you have these kids, you know, with pot belly and big heads looking, you know, as if to say they're suffering from kwashiorkor. That's the image of Africa that the West has. Walk into the streets of Los Angeles, you know, New York, and ask any of those, you know, kids on the road and says, you know, what do you think about Africa? And what they tell you is hyenas, tigers, you know, antelopes, you know, and the child, you know, with a big stomach from a TV show called Feed the Children, you know, which is one of those TV NGOs that moves around begging money from Americans to be able to feed African, you know, starving kids. That's the image that the West, that's the image that the East has about Africa. Everywhere you go, they'll ask you, are there hotels in Africa? You know, are there airports in Africa? You know, I mean, how did you get here? Once, I remember many years ago, I was in school in Louisiana, and a young girl asked me, I mean, she got pissed off with me for whatever reason, and then she asked me, how did you get to America? So I had to tell her that NASA, you know, had manufactured these beautiful planes that hover over trees like helicopters. And so we just jumped from branch, you know, into the plane and beat our uncles who still looks like monkeys and chimpanzees because they are not that human yet. But that tells you exactly how foolish, you know, the West can be when it comes to who we are on the continent. And the reason is because that is what we have sold them. That is the narrative that we have created so far as we are concerned. We have to do a better job of being able to say, this is who we are. And the first thing is put our foot on the ground and say, wait a minute, we are not borrowing from you. Forget about, bringing any kind of foreign aid. We don't need it. We have enough resources on the African continent. And what we are looking for is that whatever you're trying to get from us, it has to be in fair value. Let's talk about our diamonds. Let's talk about our lithium. Let's talk about our gold. Let's talk about our oil. How much do you have? Let's talk about uranium, like those boys in the Sahel. How much money do you have? That's what we do. We're going to negotiate like that. It's not longer the 80 cents per kilo deal like in Niger. This is $200 and something dollars. This $200 and something dollars per kilo. Let's negotiate on that. With that, we don't have to ask you to give us any money. We don't need you to be able to come in and say, this is what we want. We'll be able to print our own bonds, all right, and sell our own bonds in the marketplace, you know, back that with the minerals that we have, so that we can be able to develop and build our nations. I think that's what we should do. But as long as we have leaders who basically are looking out for themselves with no vision for the continent and always thinking about how to have a photo or picture with somebody like Joe Biden, you know, or somebody like God knows who is the president of France right now, and, you know, who is running the UK, as long as all we are thinking is about having those photo ops and, you know, traveling overseas and taking pictures and then coming back home, and so that folks who are in the media can report that you were in America, that's pathetic. That's sad. We need to do better. Let's basically begin by saying, forget about, you know, all of these, you know, foreign aid and whatnot. We don't need it. All we're looking for is fair value for what we have. and then let us renegotiate every single contract we have on the African continent, or at least in your individual nations. Let's renegotiate those contracts. Let's look into it. Let there be an appraisal. Let's know exactly what is being, how much has been taken out, and from there, I think that we can be able to have a lot more money, to help ourselves rather than continuously depending, on foreign aid, which is something that I absolutely disagree with.
Staying with you, Dr. FONGOD, now you said that Africa should be able to capitalize on what it has for it to be able to champion its own transformation. But on that point, how can Africa champion for its own transformation if we still have, say, leaders, we still have, say, groups or whatever on the African continent that will always continue to head out, say, probably to get loans or say to talk about Africa? Because I remember some time ago there was President Paul Kagame had said that African leaders sometimes do not sit amongst themselves to talk about what's happening on the continent, but they prefer to go outside of Africa to be able to discuss some of these issues. So where does Africa, at what point would Africa be able to sit down on a table, a discussion table, and champion for its own transformation?
Absolutely. It will be a radical change. It will be so radical that some of the things I'm about to say might look like lunacy. First of all, I think the United Nations, it's not a place for Africans to go and try to talk about what's happening on the African continent. Where we need to do that is not the United Nations. Where we need to do that is actually at the, the AU. We have to be able to make sure that we sit on the African continent and take care of our own issues. And then when we go to the United Nations, we are not going to United Nations as 50-something different African nations. We are going to the United Nations as a continent. We are speaking in the United Nations as a continent. We are going there as one Africa, with a Pan-African front. I think that that's the only way we basically take care of these issues. Secondly, leaders who basically try to go out because you're borrowing money and coming back and, to feed their families and do God knows what with it. We're not going to stand for that. I think that there has to be protest. There has to be mass protest. There has to be revolutions and counter-revolutions on the African continent until we figure out how to make things right. And we have to make sure that we fully get this, under control, that we don't need the West, we don't need the East, we don't need Russia, we don't need France, Germany, China. We don't need the West, which is basically Europe and America. We don't need any of them to interfere in anything that has to do with the African. Let Africa take care of its own problem. This is an in-house issue, and let us handle our in-house issue the way we need to handle it, and without all of these, foreign nations supplying arms to people who have no business carrying, holding arms. We're not interested in fighting. A lot of folks have died already on the African continent, and I think that it speaks, it doesn't speak well about us as a people. But this status quo cannot continue. This status quo cannot continue. We cannot spend another 4 decades the way we have been, another 6 decades the way we have been. Something has to change, and I hope that change happens now.
Absolutely, we look forward to change. Thank you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Now back to you, SHITTU. Listen to your co-panelists where he cited that change has to come now. Speaking of the reunification, or say Africa coming together for its own say transformation, SHITTU, in your own perspective, does the Ubuntu spirit, what does it come in as far as bringing together the African people for them to be able to champion for that change which they want on the continent?
What we must understand is that Africa is better as a united family, regardless of the narratives that the foreigners continue to push on us. We are stronger with a unified voice, and that is the more reason why African problems should be addressed by Africans, and an all-inclusive solution be figured out. Again, it is unnecessary razzmatazz and display of whatever it is that I don't know that African presidents will go to international fora just to be present there without impacting on the conversation. The best conversations we can have will happen on this continent. If there's nothing we are adding to the global conversation, then let's stick to what we are doing here. Now, one of the reasons why we have remained the way we are is because we do not have a comprehensive roadmap for the future. You ask an average Ugandan who has lived for over 35 years, he doesn't know any other president apart from the president, Yoweri Museveni. Why do we have a president who has stayed almost for 4 decades without an action plan for transition? The same thing with Rwanda. Yes, he's done a lot for the country. He's been spoken about, African unity and all that. But he stayed for way too long in power. There are lots of people who want to bring in new ideas, who want to bring alternative views, who want to bring alternative solutions to the problems of Rwanda that are unable to do that because you have a president who has continued to remain in power through, in quote, popular votes. We have another example in Cameroon where a lot of voices are being heard or are being repressed by in any case, because you have a president who has stayed long and long enough in power such that there are people who are alive today who do not know any other concept of presidency apart from what they have been born into and what they see every time on screen. In essence, if we want an Africa that is more inclusive, where the brains and the minds of Africa are able to come together to find a solution, then we must be more democratic. We must be more democratic in our ideals, in our dealings with ourselves. We must look things beyond, being authoritarian, forcing an idea upon people, trying to make sure that only your view is heard, only your political party's views are heard. So we must look beyond that and look for best practices, world best practices, best ideas around the world, and also invest in education. When we do not invest in education, what happens is that we loot people of the ingredients they need to have a fertile mind. And once the mind is not fertile enough, the ideas that keep on coming from it are very, low grade ideas. So we must fund our education properly. We must fund our institutions, our democratic institutions that make, collaboration and democratic processes more effective, and open up the civil space so that people can effectively contribute to the goings on, within the polity, within governance, and be able to speak truth to power.
Okay, Shittu, now for the case of Mali, getting the point you have said so far, when you look at Mali, do you think that some of these measures, the stringent measures which the government in place is taking as far as censoring these foreign media is concerned, it's actually going to lead to a point where this foreign media will be able to finally tell the African story from a true and authentic perspective?
I believe so. Nobody wants to be suspended, again and again, because when you are suspended, you lose a lot of money.
Absolutely.
You lose a lot of goodwill, you lose a lot of traction. Some of the
credibility
would stagnated, basically because you are off air, and some of your audiences would shift base from, waiting for you to other alternative sources. So nobody wants to do that. In any case, if after all the sanctions, after all the reprimands, the stations involved are able to introspect and look at the things they have done wrongly and elected to do something better, that will be better for them and the country. But I don't know, because considering the agenda that France has, considering the geopolitics that they are playing, against other parts of the world, we do not know if they will continue to push an agenda in the direction that they are pushing at the moment. So there's a chance that with these sanctions, France will buckle up, or Francophone stations operating on the continent will buckle up. And I'm also hoping that, the choices that we make as African countries are better off, because nothing stops us from having alternative views, but we cannot rely only on France. We should be able to have, other sources, basically.
Okay, so, yeah, proceed, Shittu.
Accurately. We lead and other. Thank you.
Okay, Shittu, now you spoke of geopolitics, and of course, these we saw when this countries actually cut ties with France in terms of military operations, and of course, France in retaliation actually came up to say it was going to cut down on its military presence on the African continent, most especially with these countries in the West African sub-region. Speaking of the three countries, that is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Now, with this in mind, with this recent decision, hopefully France is actually going, or this media is actually going to turn and of course seeing the narrative of the West African country. But away from that, you earlier on spoke of geopolitical implications. These countries in this recent times are moving towards Russia, moving towards countries in the east. With this recent decision or this recent move which we're seeing and the wind of change, choosing of different partners, could we say that, of course, the what geopolitical implications would surround this recent suspension of French media on the West African soil?
Well, most of these consortiums, news agencies, they work in collaboration. So when you suspend some of them from operating, it impacts the overall outlook, it impacts the workforce, it impacts revenue that they generate, and it also impacts how much presence they are willing to have continually in those countries. Because if they continue to suspend their licenses, for example, it means that it may cost them more to be able to operate. Again, if the suspension is repeated often than expected, there's a chance that they will pull out of these countries. And when they pull out, it means that the jobs that they had created while they are here may be lost to other news agencies. Don't expect that automatically another news agency will absorb those that have lost their jobs, for example, from one that is leaving the country. So yes, there are things that we do not have control over happening at the international stage, but we must temper some level of diplomacy and understanding in what we do, so that we are not seen as being partisan or unnecessarily supporting one country against the other. There will be continuous crisis in the world, not because we wish or we hope, but because it is a constant quest for self-enrichment, self-betterment. So countries will continue to struggle to be top ahead of others, and that is where the struggle for attention, control, of resources and control of the minds and hearts of people. So yes, we need to do better from our engagement with foreign media outlets.
Thank you, Shittu, FOWORA. Now, staying with you, we're gradually coming to the end of today's edition of Talking Points. Meanwhile, we're discussing the West African nation of Mali, where the country has suspended yet another French news broadcaster in the West African nation. Now, charting the way forward, we're seeing these countries that are advocating for change. Like you mentioned, change is the only constant thing, and Africa is headed towards its own liberation, which is in line with what your co-panelist, Dr. FONGOD, has said earlier. Now, charting the way forward, given we've seen these changes that have been made to suit the new leadership in the West African nation, as far as, championing for development, change, prosperity is concerned. Now, Shittu, now, in your opinion, what is the way forward as far as putting first the West African people, putting first the African people is concerned, so that when we're looking at change, it should be one that is going to be in the best of interest for the African people?
Well, there's a lot we can do to promote change for posterity in the media space. One of the most effective tools is investment in innovation and technology. You cannot tell the story, the African story better than the African. Therefore, when we have a media space that has leverage on technology, it allows for people who are able to adopt, the basics of reportage, to tell stories in real time, to report things as they are happening. So we do not need to wait for, the government media outlets to tell us what is happening. We do not even need to wait for the private media outlets to tell us what is happening. Citizen journalism is what you have these days. People are able to report from the streets, tell the stories, in a way that is authentic and verifiable. Therefore, when we leverage on innovation and technology, when we continue to collaborate and partner with other agencies, media agencies, when we encourage media entrepreneurship so that people who intend to invest in the media space are able to invest without unnecessary, cumbersome, rules of government that would hinder investment in that regard. Again, we must promote ethical journalism and we must not oppress media personalities in the name of press repression. So when we have all of this interplaying, there's a chance that we'll be able to have a more robust media outlet.
Thank you immensely, SHITTU FOWORA, joining us all the way from Nigeria for your input on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure for you to share your contribution with our audience. Now, we equally acknowledge the contribution of Dr. Stanley FONGOD, Pan-Africanist, who took the time to be part of us this day on Talking Point over 4U Media Africa. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of this edition of Talking Point over 4U Media Africa. Meanwhile, today we discuss this latest development in the West African nation of Mali, where the country suspended a French news broadcaster. Of course, it's on that note that we shall be putting a stop to today's edition. I've been NJIX NABESEH for presentation. Meanwhile, we wish you a great day in company of our numerous transmissions.